Добрий день, я вітаю всіх, хто приєднався до нас. Мене звуть Ольга Атаманова. Я рада вітати всіх, хто з нами онлайн.
Good afternoon. My name is Olga Tamanova, and I want to thank everybody who joins us both offline and online. It's been 10 years of the war, and today is day 454 of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by Russian aggressor. And all this time, since 2014, we know that the Russians actively use misinformation as a type of weapon of the hybrid war. And with the beginning of the full-scale invasion, nothing has changed. They continue actively using this tool, and our today's meeting is dedicated to the presentation made by our colleagues sitting right by my side. And the topic of this research is how Russia and Russian disinformation violates human rights in Ukraine and Europe. We will be talking about this, what are the cases, how they use them, what are the channels they push them through. And I want to introduce our speakers today. It's Svetlana Slipchenko, VoxUkraine project manager, Alena Grishko, senior analyst at Internews Ukraine NGO, and Lesa Bidochka, analyst at Detector Media NGO. And we expect to join us online, Vukashin Petrovich, Vice President at DT Institute. So let's start our conversation with Ms. Svetlana. So what are the propaganda messages used by Russians, how they promote them, and is it real that today everything is still actual and they continue influence our society and they continue achieving their goals? Thank you for this opportunity to start this presentation. So we're used to talk about misinformation as an abstract phenomenon which is aimed at intimidation, at promoting the narratives of the enemy, but the research that we want to present today is called to show that misinformation is something that violates the human rights to the unbiased information, and thus influences making decision by every single person. It influences life and health of the people. I mean, we're talking about the most sensitive and most popular narratives of enemy misinformation, like dehumanization of Ukrainians, the narratives related to the health, to public health, to life of Ukrainians, narratives related to the security and to the fact, to the way the battles are going on, who is the aggressor, and the narratives related to the Western control. My colleagues can tell you in details how those narratives are expressed, what are the mechanisms for spreading them. This is what our research is talking about. So I want to give the floor to my colleagues. Thank you, dear colleagues. Today we brought up a very important topic. We understand that the word, it can kill. Russian propaganda in a direct sense. They use those words and they create this illusion of distorted reality that for the time being is very actual and convenient for them. Talking about those Russian narratives that are actively spread in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, we researched the examples of how Russia demonstrated the threat which is posed by evacuation in the area of active warfare. So in Telegram channels, Russian propaganda was creating the story which was called to draw a picture that Ukraine doesn't care about its citizens who reside there. Russia tries to liberate them, and it's dangerous to evacuate, it's dangerous to consent to evacuation proposed by Ukraine. So those were examples of misinformation spread across Telegram channels, and we were studying those examples with my team. For example, from the most recent examples is that White Angels, we know White Angels is a unit which helps in evacuation, so Russia draws them as a battle unit who takes children away from their parents in the areas of active warfare. So we see quite the opposite theory which Russia uses. They use the method of mirroring to build their effective reality, to reconfirm the status of so-called country which comes to save us. And On the other hand, they show Ukraine as a country which does not care about their citizens. In fact, in this report of ours, we consider a number of cases which demonstrate to what extent Russia tries to distort this reality, showing Ukraine as a terrorist state. So in fact, they mirror what they do by themselves. They try to transfer this liability on us, the responsibility on us. So those campaigns are mostly aimed at our citizens in the temporarily occupied territories or recently deoccupied territories. Yes, we can say that those are the areas which are along the forward edge of the battle area who are directly affected by that misinformation. The people are being tried to be imposed the fact that Ukraine doesn't care about them. This is what Russia tries to demonstrate. We have to understand that we are interested in delivering the faithful information to the people who reside in those temporarily occupied territories, because they are in the hot points, in the areas of active battles, and the information is hottest there. The faithful information should be the most important thing there. We should use all the means to deliver that information to them. Thank you, Ms. Lessa. Maybe you may add something. Are there any specific ways of delivering propaganda to the denizens of Kyiv, for example, or to other places which are remote from the forward edge of the battle area, and to what extent those cases influence us? Thank you very much for this opportunity to get involved in this research and to be a part of the team. I am about to proceed to the cases right away, but I want to tell you in a little bit detail about what Detector Media team was doing within the last year. We were researching narrow misinformation, how Russia weaponizes certain categories of people and thus violates their rights. And the cases that we were researching within the last year, they were included in this presentation. We hope that this presentation will somehow structure, organize the understanding for the internal audience, the understanding why the spreading of Russian misinformation is violation of human rights, and we think that this understanding will be also picked up by Western audience. So about the cases which were straight fakes, and we included them in our research. For example, the fact that Ukraine uses the ambulance vehicles to transport armed personnel. So we understand that this information brings some distrust in people, and it creates a distorted understanding of reality. So as if Ukraine violates the Geneva Convention, which contemplates that transportation of the military personnel, armed military personnel, should be going on with the special vehicles, using special vehicles. So if the school buses or ambulance vehicles are used, those civil vehicles can be an easy target for the enemy, and that would be absolutely justified in that case. So people may have the sentiment of fear and distrust, for example, when they would need to use that ambulance vehicle. This vehicle can be shot at because it's being used for transportation of the armed military personnel, and Russians can seize them as target and shell them. Another example of fake Russian messages, there was a message related to spreading of the mass diseases, as if in the ranks of Ukrainian armed forces there is tuberculosis and cholera being spread very quickly, which influences the image of the army and the way how their citizens perceive the armed forces. And then there was a discreditation of the healthcare system, that the planned operations, planned surgeries were suspended in Kyiv, for example, because all the hospitals are chock full with the wounded military from Bakhmut, and there is a lack of donor blood in the hospitals, and so on and so forth. Another case is the case of deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia. For example, in that case, Russia was talking, they were justifying the fact of deportation of Ukrainian children as if it's a revenge for the children of Donbass. So as if children of Donbass are the children of Russia and they should be brought to Russia, as if Ukraine assists and supports killings of the Donbass children, so they should be deported, and children of Donbass, they have better lives in Russia than in Ukraine. So that is the number of ways that Russia was taking children away from their families on the premises of recreation programs, bringing them to the safer regions, and that's again a violation of the human rights, the delivery of the unfaithful information about the children of Donbass, for example, who are the children of Ukraine, but Russia keeps saying that they are children of Russia. We also had a case about the evacuation campaign. My colleague has already mentioned it. The only thing I may add is that we remember that campaign started back in August 2022 when along the in the communities along the forward edge of the battle area, Ukraine started carrying people away with trains because we were understanding the winter is coming and the battles are coming in that area. So Russia was telling that in that way Ukraine tries to clear those territories so that Ukrainian armed forces come to pillage those houses afterwards. Or they were telling that you are being evacuated with those evacuation trains, but there is no bulletin for you prepared over there, you're going nowhere. And in the eve of the difficult cold month of winter, when there was no water, heat or power supply, people were staying in their homes for winter because they could be influenced by that type of Russian messages that no one is waiting for you there, you better stay there under the bombs, and it could result, well, in fact, it resulted in a huge number of deaths. Also, I can mention a number of tactics used by Russia, because we've just mentioned the fakes and manipulations and unfaithful information. Russia also uses the tactics like join the masses. Is the tactics that is like the majority thinks so you should be thinking in the same way. And another tactic of absurd ideas about, for example, biolaboratories. This idea seems absurd to us, but people start believing it. For example, about the NATO garrisons in Ukraine, or for example, there is the exaggeration of reasons. There is an event A and event B, and then they do not influence each other because there's a number of other events influencing each other. But Russia, they simplify it and they try to connect those events. Then they use the tactics of the scapegoats. For example, they pose Azov as a Nazi regiment. Then the heroization tactics, the use of biases. I will mention the biases maybe a little bit later, because I think that in the end we will be talking about how and what are other joint projects that we can work on with my colleagues, in what direction should we move, and a part of that report that we are presenting today. Thank you very much. Recently visiting our studio was a child who was previously deported and then brought back by our civil organization. She was brought back to her mother, and on her example she was saying that she left because she was told that Ukrainian military would come and rape her. So we understand that this propaganda, it takes place, it is being delivered to the people. So what are the mechanisms that the occupiers use to make sure that the proper recipients of those messages, they are being delivered those messages? I think that people who end up under influence of Russian propaganda are people who are in stressful conditions otherwise, because the case that you just mentioned, it's a person who was living near the forward edge of the battle area. They don't know what to expect from the dynamics of the front line. They live in fear, and when they hear some absolutely incredible information that Ukrainian armed forces would come and do harm to you, so when people are afraid, they don't take information critically, and they're capable of believing anything. And under stressful conditions like that, under unsure conditions like that, people are more inclined to believe, and all those biases that they have, the stereotypes they have, they are only reinforced under those stressful conditions of the warfare. I would also like to add that under conditions of occupation during the active warfare, Russia tries to install the information monopoly, so to say. It's expressed in limiting the access to Ukrainian resources, and again, it's about the violation of human rights, the access to information, the right to access to information. We remember the cases of dissemination of different propaganda leaflets. We remember the trucks with the screens installed on them in Mariupol, which were translating the propaganda news. And I agree with my colleagues that when you are being imposed this monopoly of Russian propaganda, and your emotions, your prevalent emotions are fear, and something that we even find it hard to imagine. Unfortunately, under conditions like that, you start believing even in the most absurd fakes. On top of that, we remember that Russia tries to kill the access to information even in that part of Ukraine where there are no active battles. Remember the strike on the TV tower in Kyiv and in Volyn region, and in Rivne, if I'm not mistaken. It was about a year ago, so I may be mistaken. So again, it's an attempt to restrict the access to the state broadcaster in Ukraine, to different official sources of information. The cyber attacks committed against official Ukrainian state bodies, I mean their web resources, their web pages, so people can get access to information. It's all a direct information attack and the restriction of the right of access to information. I agree with you, and I think that you would agree if I say that if we compare the things that were happening back in 2014, we've made a great leap in the direction of countering misinformation. So what helps us, and where you see some gaps where we need to work some more? I think that my colleagues will agree with me. The level of trust for today and the media literacy among the population has grown. In the last year, we've seen the results of the research, of the joint research with Internews USA in regard of the media. We've seen that 60% of the information is being received by Ukrainians from Telegram. Regardless that, we understand that Telegram as a source of information is unregulated, and information being spread there, it requires additional verification, and we see that information that Ukrainians cope with that. There is misinformation being spread, but Ukrainians take it skeptically mostly. The subscribers, the people are subscribed to the official channel, so they consume information in a conscious manner. They read a list of some recommended sources, and on part of the government we have the list of channels provided, which are confirmed to be spread as the ones that spread Russian misinformation. So we see recommendations by the government, we see this recommendation letter, the control regarding what should be consumed, so population accepts it. They read only the, or not only, but mostly verified information, and they try to verify this information by matching that information from different sources, and this information, it resonated in the society previously, it triggered the emotions, but now we access it with a cold mind. We understand that we are in the war conditions, and any information which is unverified, which is unreliable, may result in some irreparable damage, and if it spreads, this damage may be even on a broader scale. Mr. Lukashenko We hope you're seeing us. I'm asking our technical team to bring our speaker on the screen if he's joining us online. Well, we're not seeing. Oh. Good afternoon, Mr. Vukashin. We're hoping you're hearing us because we're hearing you. We want to invite you to join our conversation. We know that unfortunately Russian propaganda continues to use their campaigns not only in Ukraine, but also in Europe. So to what extent have you learned already to counter Russian misinformation, the misinformation which is launched specifically for the population of European Union? What are the weak links, in your opinion, in the information security system over there? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question, and thank you very much for organizing the press conference for this, let's say, very, very important issue. I would like to make 3 points. And this is something that the report that our Ukrainian colleagues worked on together with our support is that it tries to highlight that the disinformation and propaganda constitute violation of the right to the freedom of expression under international law. And that as such, we need to look at disinformation propaganda not just something that is trying to put the wedges between nations to undermine social cohesion, but that under international law is a human rights violation that needs to be addressed both by the governments, international organizations, but then also companies that are providing social media platforms that are amplifying disinformation and propaganda. Now, just to go back to the basic definition of freedom of expression as it is framed under Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 19 says that everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression, and that this includes freedom to hold opinions without interference. And what the disinformation propaganda actually do is they interfere with our ability to hold and form our opinions freely. And from that perspective, I would say, what this report and what we are trying to do is to ensure that disinformation propaganda is not just seen as some necessary, not necessary, but all-present evil, that it's just there to undermine our ability to go and to receive information freely, but it actually constitutes the violation of human rights. And looking from that perspective, I would say that while the European countries, and as well as other democracies around the world, have put in place many, I would say, tools, many institutions, and many processes to combat disinformation and propaganda, we still haven't done enough to address disinformation and propaganda as a human rights violation. I mean, ultimately, and why we see Russian disinformation and propaganda as very dangerous is that, the goal is not just to confuse people about what is going on in their countries or what is going on in the world. But it is there to undermine our trust in democratic institutions. It's there to undermine values and our trust in human rights and democratic values, and ultimately to undermine European cohesion on critical issues and to undermine cohesion of the countries, including Ukraine, including Germany, including Spain, including, I would say, us as democratic societies. And at this stage, most of the work has been done at the level of trying to provide accurate information and to debunk disinformation. Yet, much less work has been done to actually reinforce democratic values, reinforce human rights values that are under threat by disinformation propaganda. And one of the things that I hope we are going to do going forward is focus much more on reinforcing those values, reinforcing those social norms that makes democracies successful and prosperous.
Я дуже дякую. Ми всі намагаємося.
Thank you very much. We're all trying to talk about misinformation and propaganda through the prism of violation of human rights, but can we put it in a legal plane, in your opinion? What should we do as a civil society or on the level of the government to approve it as the violation of human rights? What are the international institutions we have to address? Because we see everybody who's working on the misinformation on part of Russian government, we know them by names. What are the steps that we should take in this direction? Well, first of all, we need to appeal to international documents that are recognized by all the civilized countries with whom we can cooperate in this area is the General Declaration of Human Rights and International Pact of Civil and Political Rights. It can be appealed to international organizations based on those documents. So something like this. If you have anything to add, please. I completely agree with my colleagues that we should appeal to international organizations, but at the same time we have to remember that the response from them would not be quite prompt. For example, we already submit a report with a number of details, with the detailed explanations what are the mechanisms, how the human rights are being violated, but we cannot expect to have a quick reaction from the international organizations. There would be no prompt recognition of Russia as the information aggressor, but every step, every action, every activity by the international organizations, and even every step made by simple citizens who inform, who communicate what is misinformation and what is truth, they are enough to make sure that it is understood what is Russian misinformation and to what extent and how they violate the rights not only of Ukrainians, but if we go deeper, for example, we made that research in the 6 countries, how the narratives are being spread about Ukraine in those countries. We presented that research here in Media Center. So again, this misinformation influences political preferences of Europeans. They can, for example, start supporting pro-Russian forces in their countries, and eventually it is the influence on their right to access the faithful information, because their information space is being littered with fakes and manipulation. So Russia, for example, now we're focused in Ukraine, but there is a similar violation of human rights which is committed by Russia in other countries. They spread their propaganda and misinformation over there. Dear colleagues, I want to state a hypothesis which I want you to either debunk or confirm. Here in Ukraine, we've learned to work with misinformation better. We've learned to counter it better than in European countries. If it is so, please comment, and maybe thus we can somehow help our international partners to improve that work in European Union as well. I can tell you for sure, yes, my colleagues may disagree with me, but for what I see, Ukraine is a world leader now in fighting Russian misinformation. A lot of steps are taken in that direction. There are institutions, the civil institutions that work for a number of years. They were working with fakes or media literacy before, or they were researching journalism standards. Starting from 24th of February, they switched to fighting the Russian misinformation. They started reinforced dialogue with government and with other countries, and as my colleagues mentioned, our long years of work brought its fruits today. Now Ukrainians don't believe on a broad scale to this misinformation as Russians do in Russia, or maybe even as Europeans do. For what I know from our colleagues fact checkers, they have problems with identification of origins of misinformation. They not always understand that some narratives, they originate from Russia, because they don't go deeper into those details. For example, my colleagues mentioned Telegram. Telegram is popular in Ukraine, and other social networks, they are more popular in other countries, and from there some narratives and messages may migrate to media of other countries. So in Ukraine there are such institutions established which react to the propaganda, to those fakes, and they debunk them. Those are the official websites, TV, and such platforms as media centers, so we could promptly talk about what is the misinformation narrative. I'm not sure that the similar practice is in place in Europe. I have not observed anything like that. And on top of that, there are different conferences, summits that are going on to counter misinformation. It's not a broad story, it's not a popular story, it's a narrow thing that only some experts like us, my colleagues, understand, and we as Ukrainians are being invited to talk about our experience, so we can proceed to this phase of teaching the world how to fight Russian propaganda and misinformation. Well, I agree with Svetlana. For the time being, we may state that Ukraine has an incredible experience of monitoring misinformation specifically, and thanks to the fact that there are civil organizations, civil activists who monitor it, and they get united in coalitions, and there are such wonderful products of this cooperation as our report that we present today, because it has a collection of the research of organizations which were involved in its development. So we have to understand that there is a question, to what extent is Russian propaganda efficient abroad? So it's a research, it's a perspective research, because Russia uses similar techniques and methods for discreditation of Ukraine, and the technologies that they use abroad to discredit Ukraine, and this is how they penetrate to the media space of other countries. So Ukrainian experience is a very good case, so which we can share. We can show how the activists, how civil society works, and how it is being supported by international organizations, how the governments listen to those proposals, to those methods to counter misinformation, monitor misinformation. And it's probable that we may organize summits or forums to discuss by the representatives of different countries to those narratives, to match them, to see the similarities in them. We had a research with our colleagues from Slovakia. We've checked 10 years of Russian propaganda in Facebook, and what's most interesting is that every representative of our country, we were researching their sections of Facebook, and we found pro-Kremlin actors who were spreading similar narratives about Ukraine. So we see there are identical messages, but the matter is how they were spread. And in Ukraine, for example, thanks to the fact that we actively block all those Russian narratives, we identified less messages containing Russian propaganda in regard of Ukraine. They were able to identify it in their territory. Mr. Vukashin, the question will be to you. What do you see? What do you document? What are the tools that Russian propagandists use to spread misinformation in the European Union?
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much for your question. And again, we are not so much worried about tools necessarily, but we are much more worried about strategies that Russia is using. And again, you know, as I mentioned before, something that it's very much of a focus on ours. In addition to narratives that our colleagues, including VoxUkraine, Texty, and others, are really doing a great job about identifying and analyzing not just within Ukraine, but also Central Europe and broader. And our colleagues VoxUkraine have been doing this work with us now for years, including monitoring disinformation, Russian disinformation and propaganda in countries such as Germany, Italy, Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic, etc., etc., etc. Where our focus at the moment is analyzing that disinformation further and trying to understand what emotions, and more specifically, what negative emotions is trying to evoke. And it's very clear that, Russian disinformation propaganda is trying to evoke emotions of anger, distrust, and more importantly, of fear. And that through their effects, they do try to effectively, scare population in Europe. They try to make them angry, and they try to make them to be disgusted. And all these three emotions are critical for undermining basic human values that are of importance for democracy as the system. Furthermore, by evoking fear, they're trying to promote a strong rule as an alternative to chaos and as an alternative to insecurity. They are using anger to turn European citizens against liberal ideas. And they're using disgust in a similar way to promote traditional values. In other words, they are very good or Russia is trying very much, not just to, say wrong things about events that are happening, but to shape how we feel about the reality and to change social norms that underpin our system, to effectively destroy values that are behind us as democratic society, in order then to help pro-authoritarian sides, to pro-authoritarian forces, to take public opinion, to take citizens towards the system of values and system of government that Russia and Kremlin are more comfortable with. So, focus of our research and our activities increasingly not just debunking disinformation, but reinforcing values that are of importance for democracy.
Дуже дякую вам, шановні колеги.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. If you have any questions, please join our conversation. And meanwhile, I want to ask you about such an important thing, that during your research, to what extent have you identified what is the audience existing in Ukraine which is the most vulnerable to the fakes, to the topic of promotion of those propaganda narratives used by Russia? Can we distort it, or shouldn't we circumvent ourselves, and we all may end up as victims of such propaganda, such work by Russian Federation? Thank you for this question. We cannot say absolutely that someone is more or less vulnerable. Well, we are more or less vulnerable to a different extent, but we all may believe in something that is incredible, that is difficult to really believe. I would like to get back to the most recent conversation about the misinformation spreading in Europe, but Europe is not so homogeneous, because some countries, they shut down Russia Today, for example, a media financed from the budget of Russian Federation, or for example Sputnik, and other countries, they reopen Russia Today. For example, RT Belkans was opened in the autumn last year, and those topics that they talk about, they resonate with local societies. Those are the topics of the cold winter, of gas, anti-NATO topics. Well, we all remember Yugoslavia and the role of America. So Russia tries to use this historic revisionism. They try to use the topic of territorial disputes, the discrepancies, the differences, and they manage to find the topics that resonate in those societies: anti-NATO, anti-Americanism, anti-European Union, and so on. There are many anti-Ukrainian messages there. So before the creation of Tank Coalition, there was a lot of calls to the West not to give weapons to Ukraine. For example, Croatia, which is part of NATO, Russia Today even found some listeners there, and those messages were quite widespread and popular there. What to do about it? Or what can Ukraine do about it? Ukraine can give more of its media, which will tell more over there what is really going on, because, for example, RT Balkans, they disseminated the information like join Wagner group. So it's an open call, open invitation, or they spread it information that Russia gives you this number of thousands of dollars if you take a Western tank from Ukraine. So this is the information proposed by Russian media, financed from Russian budget. Ukraine has to do something, because we cannot keep doing debunking all the time, because someone who watches Russia Today, they won't visit the Detector Media website to verify that information. We have to propose a different agenda. And another way is what, for example, Ukraine has done with those channels that we've done to oligarch channels before in the beginning of the invasion, or before that, just shut down those TV channels. Well, there was a lot of polarity in the society whether those TV channels should be shut down or not. It's only now that we see that it was an absolutely necessary step. There was a lot of negotiations in the European Union as to the cessation of activities of Russian propaganda media. So let's summarize. How can we influence this situation? We see Europe started understanding those processes. They got actively involved in countering misinformation. Unlike, for example, Global South, as we call it, over there we see that there's a lot of work to be done in that area. So how can we reinforce our work here? Well, for what I see, Ukraine should open more foreign language broadcasters to impose our official vision, deliver our position, our agenda, not in episodes, not with some excerpts from Euronews, from BBC. It should be a Ukrainian broadcaster which would broadcast in English language and which would have certain number of hours of broadcasting and something like that. Well, Ms. Svetlana, well, I agree, and on contrary, we need more representation of Western channels and media in Ukraine, so they take the original information from here. We have Associated Press, we have Reuters correspondents working here, they have access to information, but just like my colleague mentions, they are transnational media, but talking about something local, like Balkans were mentioned recently. Let their representatives come to us, and from the word of mouth, from the first hand, find out what's going on, and it would be a very well example of fighting the violation of human rights by propaganda. And the debunking only, yes, it's necessary, but it's obviously not enough. But there will be an alternative. Okay, you read Russia Today. Unfortunately, you read it, but at the same time, you read some faithful news, some true news from Ukraine, and they will be more adequate and logical than Russian propaganda. Yes, I agree with my colleagues. We have to deliver this information, the reality of those things happening now, because even the colleagues who come from abroad, they join Ukrainian journalists who show them the reality, who tell them the real stories, who walk them along those places. They show that reality that really exists in Ukraine. For example, me and my colleagues, we read Russian sources only for scientific purposes, to get ourselves familiarized with what is being told about us and to forecast what Russia would say later on. So it's important to have meetings like this, not to restrict the information with for the foreign audience. Ms. Vukashin, we would be happy to see some advice for us. What can be done, in your opinion, to improve the situation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So there are three very concrete things that we can do at the European level to improve the situation. One is we need more coordinated regional approach to countering disinformation and propaganda. What last few years have shown is that Russia thinks in terms of regions when it comes to disinformation propaganda, and disinformation narratives that we are seeing and that our colleagues from Ukraine are trying to help us to identify and to counter show that disinformation propaganda narratives in Central Europe across all countries are very, very similar, similar with Balkan countries, and that, as we think about how to counter it, we cannot counter disinformation just in one country, knowing that disinformation that is coming from other countries in the region will spill over. So one is regional approach. Second one is whole of society approach. And again, we focus so much on very few aspects of our media consumption. Most of our countering disinformation efforts are focused on news content and social media. Yet a lot of disinformation propaganda happens, through other types of media content. And we really have to think about, first and foremost, video and TV, and I would say more broadly, pop culture as a way to counter disinformation propaganda. At the end, all research in Europe shows that 18 to 35s spend over 6 hours or around 6 hours every day consuming different types of pop culture. And yet we do very little to use that to counter disinformation propaganda and counter disinformation propaganda narratives. So one is regional approach. Second one is thinking about what types of media content we can use to counter disinformation and broadening our understanding of how we can reach our audiences, and from that perspective, thinking about how, in addition to fact checkers and governments, we can include content creators and creative professionals in doing this. And the third one, and I think that this is probably the most important one, is understanding that Russian disinformation and propaganda would not have as much effect if there were not domestic actors that are more than ready to amplify disinformation propaganda. And I would say when it comes to EU, probably the weakest links are politicians who are ready to adopt Russian disinformation propaganda narratives when it suits their political agenda. And we have to find also a way how we are going to deal with those actors, and as I said, first and foremost, political actors within our countries and within the EU that purposely amplify Russian disinformation propaganda for their own advantage.
Дуже дякую вам. Що ж, друзі, підсумуємо цю зустріч.
Thank you very much. Let's summarize this meeting. We understand that propaganda is not going anywhere. The Russians keep using them for a 10th year in a row, and I'm sure that they were using propaganda way before the beginning of the war, and they will continue doing it. So all together we have to learn and we have to reinforce our knowledge how to spread how to fight misinformation, specifically during the war. For example, we have to remember that fact-checking is necessary, fact-checking is required. Please use verified information, subscribe to verified channels, and use verified information. Thank you very much for this research. Thank you very much for this conversation. I'm reminding you that our team is working on the schedule for tomorrow, so stay tuned, follow our announcements, and we want to thank our armed forces and continue working together for our victory, and glory to Ukraine.